I want us to proceed on down the path that she began to answer there at the end. What are some of the values that mitigate against working, in this arena? And I want to take a step back even further. And I want us to name a crisis of credibility. Bonnie Christian, I mentioned to you both, recently published a book called Untrustworthy, where she looks at the crisis of knowledge and the crisis of knowing. And one of the chapters in that book is a crisis of skepticism toward expertise. So we're in a local congregation, you're a pastor of a congregation, or you're interacting with folks in your home group or whatever, and someone says, I just don't trust the science. It's too politicized. How do you answer? How do I answer? I know how you answer. Help me answer that question, right? Give me confidence as someone interacting with someone who may be skeptical toward science itself and certainly toward climate science.
Well, it might be starting by how I would answer it, but I often find that if I'm sitting in the pew next to someone in my own home church, actually this has happened, and we start, some environmental or climate change issue comes up, there's an assumption that I wouldn't be a scientist working on those issues, right? And so when then you start talking about them and then you realize that this person that you've been trying to figure out how to do Christian life with together actually has some expertise or knowledge in that, you are more likely to ask more questions and lean in because you already have a relationship of trust. Mm-hmm. And so part of it is, who can you find that are already trusted messengers to tell the story? Because you can certainly find a lot of messengers who might have scientific credibility but have no real cultural or local credibility, sure. And then it actually does more damage. So how can you find those people who might even be sitting with you in your own pew who vocationally maybe work on these issues that can, be more effective?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think you make a great observation that, especially during the COVID crisis, this really heightened that, but it's been something that's been underlying in the culture for at least a century. Mm-hmm. Not in perpetuity, however. That's not how it's always been. Actually, there's a really wonderful, if you make it out to Washington, D.C., the Museum of the Bible has a new exhibit called Science in the Scriptures.
Oh, really?
And it talks about how God reveals truth to us, because ultimately what is our faith and science are both different pursuits towards truth, looking at it from different ways, looking at truth in different but related spheres. Mm-hmm. And what I love is that actually the orthodox position between the Christian faith and science, or the study of God's creation, the natural world, has been one of mutual compatibility. It talks about the two books, mm-hmm. the book of Scripture and supernatural revelation, and the other way that God speaks to us, and it's throughout Scriptures of saying, He reveals himself through nature, through his created works. We have the book of nature that also reveals God. And again, this is orthodox theology. And so, but it is something that we've forgotten. But another thing, again, to Rachel's point, and again, I'm the fruit of that witness of having a scientist in the pews and discovering that there was a scientist in the pews. Because I think because of this atmosphere that science and faith are inherently in conflict, and of course us as Christians, good Christians, would never be a scientist, it makes us stay silent as those who are in the science fields. We may be hesitant to share that explicitly, but there's really wonderful research, surveys done by Elaine Eklund out of Baylor, who's looked at who are scientists, what are scientists, and what are their religious affiliations. And what she finds of surveying scientists is contrary to the myth that all scientists are atheists or agnostic or don't recognize the spiritual. In America, about upwards of 20 to 25% recognize and have a Christian-related faith. Another 50, if you add that in, 50% are part of some traditional religious affiliation or institution. And then 75% then recognize there's something spiritual out there. It's just not in the material world. Yeah. And so even knowing and hearing those stories of why I became a scientist, sharing those stories, having those scientists in the pews feel emboldened to share who we are is really critical of breaking down that trust gap.
Good, thank you. And then I know we took a brief look at the Wise Stewards website. So let's assume that most of the people we interact with on a daily basis aren't going to read scientific journals. They may read popular mechanics, maybe not, but most of them are not going to access academic literature. So if I wanted to help someone become more confident in the science of climate change, what resources could we point folks to? Websites, books, if people read books anymore, but that, you know what I'm trying to say, where can we help people go to gain some confidence in climate science?
I'd point them to Katharine Hayhoe's website and her YouTube videos. Dr. Katharine Hayhoe has a wonderful series of YouTube videos called Global Weirding.
Yeah.
And, you know, they're bite-sized, you can choose which topic excites you, and one thing that she always says is what's the most viewed video there is what does the Bible say about acting on climate.
Yeah.
And so that's a really, really wonderful resource. The other thing I'd say is also, though, just to internalize your why. Why do you care? And being able to communicate that with others. Is it because I love going out hiking? I love skiing, making that connection and how that then informs my actions. That's a really important way of also having those conversations, steering it a bit away from the science sometimes, so you don't have to field, well, I was, all of the scientific facts, but again, bringing that personal connection, that's something that folks can't deny.
Yeah.
Well, I would just echo that. I think one other website that comes to mind, which is if you're really interested in digging in a little bit deeper, is Skeptical Science. Because skepticalscience.com will basically present these big picture, the big questions people usually ask when you're like skeptical or not sure about all things related to climate. And then it breaks down the answers in different degrees of complexity depending how far you want to go. So if you just want a high level, like, I wonder what an approach to that question might be, you can get the top line summary, or you can dig in deeper. So I think Katharine Hayhoe's YouTube videos are incredible, and they're supported by PBS. I think they're meant to be really accessible to the public. If you are interested, you could always dig in further that way. But I agree. I think the way to bring people in is it's okay to have questions. So we want to create a space where people can say, this is what I've heard. That was my attitude in my story, is I feel like I heard some things, but I wasn't sure, so I wanted to go someplace where I could ask questions and learn for myself. So I want to emphasize that that's a positive thing. We want to encourage people to have questions and invite them in, but you don't have to be an expert to share why it is that you care. The scientific consensus is behind you in the weeds, but what we're going to do about it, that takes us to decide. It can be science-informed, but it's not actually a science question. It's an ethical question.
That's a good point. It is perhaps an excuse because I don't want to do anything about it. I'm going to question the science, right?
Yeah, and I'll add one more resource if I can. I was just thinking about this. NASA has a wonderful set of resources around climate change, and that might surprise you. NASA doesn't just point their satellites and telescopes out to look at the cosmos, but they point them back towards Earth. And I mean, Rachel, you're a real expert of using that data, but NASA is a real leader in understanding the science of climate change, and an excellent communicator, too, of putting that in plain language. So I direct folks to NASA also.
Yeah, thanks. So Skeptical Science website, skepticalscience.com, probably. Katharine Hayhoe's YouTube channel and website. And Hayhoe is spelled Hayhoe? Is that close? And then the NASA website as well. Great, thank you. So before we get to submitted questions, I have one more that I want to just kind of, a bigger framing question, right? kind of questions that attack the foundation of all the great information that you have shared with us today. There are times when it seems like the actions related to climate change, mitigation, what's the other one? Mitigation and adaptation actually work against human flourishing for those whose way of life and survival involves them in work that is environmentally damaged. And I shared with you the example of where I grew up in Appalachia, where coal mining, both deep mining and then more at the end strip mining, obviously environmentally damaging. But for many people that we knew, that was the only way they thought they could survive, is working in that industry. So can you just reflect more broadly on this tension that seems to emerge between those whose very living and subsistence involves behaviors that are contradictory to practices related to stewardship, wise stewardship?
I think good solutions to the climate crisis have to invite people in, and they really shouldn't leave anyone behind. And to do that well, though, takes real targeted resolution on the very types of communities that you're talking about, like is true for coal mining communities across Appalachia. It might be true for many industries probably around here, around natural gas or related kind of extraction industries. It's taking a close look at what it means to really provide targeted assistance or retraining, programs that move people forward, while recognizing that it is real for those people. They might be participating in those economies for generations. That's like a part of their identity, and it's a real sense of loss. So actually local communities and perhaps the church could be a really interesting asset in that kind of conversation about how do we ensure that people are cared for in the transition in a really specific way, even as we're looking for bigger structures and solutions that are going to have to move the needle on industries, on policies, on economies.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think it really is recognizing that our energy producers, our energy workers, our industrial workers, they really are on the front lines of putting their health and safety on the line for us. And so sometimes there is this narrative of you are part of the problem, you are an enemy, but actually, are we appreciating what they're doing for us? But then also, what is that duty and responsibility of corporations and industry to take care of their workers, be good neighbors to the communities that they're in? Again, we talked about coal mining, but also looking at Cancer Alley in Louisiana,
right,
and the industries that have been cited in communities of color. Again, that brings jobs and addresses that immediate need, but we need to make sure that they are being good neighbors, industry, to the rest of the community, treating industry well. And again, that also gets down to advocacy, of being engaged in that advocacy, whether that's locally with the corporations themselves or at the state, federal level. But really, it gets down to, in all of our vocations and spheres, are we being good neighbors to each other? And how can we as people of faith be a part of that solution of saying, we're grateful for the good things that come from this, but we also have to address the negatives.
Mm-hmm. I appreciate the emphasis on advocacy simply because for the vast majority of people in the world, they can't afford adaptation and mitigation.
It's tricky because you might say they can't afford to opt in, but they certainly are going to bear the costs.
That's right.
Of no action.
More than anyone else. That's right.
And so it's really challenging. So I think it invites us into the conversation for, yes, how we can take responsibility within our own sphere of influence and then advocate that we create options and avenues for people to be able to participate in a way that's good for them. Right. And a way they want to. I mean, I think I wanted to emphasize this earlier, but I'll say it again. Even if it's a strong attention on, I mentioned U.S. responsibility given our historic impact. Actually, I also feel that some of the best, most creative, ingenuitive solutions are going to come from the global south. They're going to come from out there, and we need to be receptive in thinking about how that works itself out in practice here. So it's less about us just thinking how we're going to help them, but actually more of a community context where actually the church is a really great example of this. It is the global church, how we learn from our brothers and sisters about what they're experiencing, what they're doing, what their strategies are, and maybe we come alongside and support them in what they're doing.
Right. When you think about those who can address the problem on a big scale, government, NGO, business, massive corporations, NGOs or international agencies, and government, who's the most active?
I think the global conversation has continued to increase such that every one of those buckets you just mentioned are at the table. Mm-hmm. Everyone has their own interests that they're advancing in the conversation, so you have to be aware of that and sensitive to that. But just on the corporate scale, I've actually seen an incredible amount of large multinational organizations starting to better understand their footprint, trying to understand how to reduce it, and actually think about how to deliver products that are actually much more socially and environmentally responsible. So sometimes we don't think about corporations as maybe an asset in the conversation, but I've seen a lot of movement there.
Good.
Yeah, and I think that's a really important reframing of so often these conversations have been so-and-so's part of the problem. You're the problem. There's lots of fingerprinting. We need to flip that and say, you are a key part of the solution. And we need to spur to action, again, to create that healthier, brighter world. And again, one thing as we were talking about energy workers in communities and how that can also impact health and have negative impacts. Again, we're at the dawn of a century where we can revitalize communities by doing it the right way, of learning from the mistakes of the past and doing development at all different scales in a really healthy and bright way, which is really exciting, and seeing everyone playing on that. I'll also say, as you were mentioning, from government to NGOs to industry, who makes up? Who are sitting in those seats? Who is in that
Yes.
work? And we find that there are Christians
Yes.
working in all of those sectors. And again, of bringing our voice, especially as Rachel laid out for us, of that theocentric worldview that values all of creation, people, and the natural world, while also looking at the totality of well-being, both economic sustainability, environmental sustainability, and health. Wow. We can make some real change by applying our values in our vocations.
Right. You mentioned Madagascar earlier, or somebody did in the conversation, I guess Dr. Richter. And so we know of Christians engaged in reforestation projects in Madagascar. There are expressions of the church that perhaps aren't as grand in scale as the three that we mentioned, but are grand. And as you pointed out, particularly in the developing world. Let me ask another question, if I could. I won't be nearly as aggressive with the next ones as perhaps I may have seemed up to this point. Is it too late?
No, not at all.
And what gives you the confidence to say that?
Well, one thing we can look at is Rachel had shown us some of those projections of what the future might look like. I showed some graphs that said if we don't make a change, what could it look like? And you may hear a lot about, well, how certain can we be about whether that's the future we're going to have? How certain and reliable are those projections and models? Well, the greatest source of uncertainty of what future we're going to have is not inherent in the climate models. It's in what we as people choose to do. And so, again, as you see, there was that big difference even in the heat deaths. If we make the cuts that we need to in carbon emissions, as well as that, again, gets us the air pollution, if we do those cuts, we can make a huge difference. So no, it's not too late at all.
And we've seen tremendous progress by, I mentioned these kind of big international frameworks like the Paris Agreement, which seems so, maybe for many of us, seem kind of out there, and you wonder how actually effective they are. But then they get translated to national commitments that are real. They put their money behind them. And then they get translated to state-level commitments and city-level commitments. And as somebody who is often looking at our numbers to figure out whether or not we're actually reaching our goals, we are reaching our goals. In fact, we are exceeding our goals, which means all the things that we're doing to bring multiple people into the conversation and thinking about creative strategies, it's actually having a real quantifiable impact, and you can see it on the ground. So like the beautiful example of greening up urban spaces and actually measuring on the ground the change in like heat exposure at the same time as seeing those numbers start to show up at a statewide or a national scale in terms of emissions, we have both. So there are examples of change. It's being backed up by numbers, but it's going to continue to take all of us to keep fighting for that future that we want.
You know, the government is the problem isn't in the Bible. Yeah, that mentality is very much a part of, certainly in regional expressions of Christianity. And so there is this natural resistance to trusting Washington to do anything, or trusting Paris. What on earth do the French have to say about climate change in America? And those kinds of, I've heard these things. I don't know, to be honest with you, if we can say with all honesty that Scripture is the dominant authority in the church, in the evangelical church.
Well, I did mention we have to confront idols. And
yes.
Confronting idols do mean allegiances that we hold that might actually transcend the ones that we say that we have. So,
that's correct.
I do think sometimes, especially in American evangelicalism, sometimes our commitments to our political ideologies or our economic ideologies sometimes work themselves out more dominantly than other ones that we say we have, like in allegiance to God and trying to make sense of what it means to follow him in the world. So
yeah, and what is there? The common saying recently amongst pastors is I've got folks for an hour, hour and a half, maybe 2 hours at best in some churches, and the rest of the week they're with cable news.
Right.
So that's a real challenge that we have to address. And again, is a lot of times out of our control. But again, what we have found, especially at the Evangelical Environmental Network, is to cut through that noise by, again, helping folks make that personal connection of how these topics of environmental stewardship, climate action, how that impacts your life, your family, your kids, your grandkids, the people that you care about. And whenever you can bring it back to that lens, it really helps to, and then reinforce it with Scripture,
right.
Really pointing back to Scripture. That can help break down some of those idols that we've set up for ourselves.
So make sure folks know Evangelical Environmental Network. How do you get to that? Where do you get those resources?
Right, we are at creationcare.org.
creationcare.org, and that's a affiliate organization with NAE, National Association of Evangelicals?
We have been long-standing board members and been real partners with the National Association of Evangelicals. One really exciting thing, and maybe a great resource for you to explore, is just last year, we did an update and re-release of a climate report and its impact on poverty at home and around the world with the National Association of Evangelicals, World Relief, and the Evangelical Environmental Network. And I want to stress that this was an update and a re-release.
Yeah.
We actually had that report out in 2011, even before the Pope published Laudato Si. And so, again, I think that's a wonderful resource that you can point to dispel that myth that evangelicals don't care about this. Well, at least for over the last decade, you can point to that and say, evangelicals do.
Yeah.
And I would just add, because I think EEN does this really well, but it's actually talking about climate change it is actually a bipartisan issue, even though it doesn't feel that way often, because really climate change is something that affects all of us. And when you really translate it down to a local scale, no matter which political party that you participate in, you can actually see how the people that you represent might be impacted. And what we need to create space for is good solutions from across the spectrum. So actually, I want to see lots of healthy debate about what kinds of solutions we should be looking for at a policy scale and an economic scale. And I want Republican and Democratic and anyone in between participating in the discussion. So what we need to do is move it away from climate change as a Democratic issue to saying climate change is an everyone issue. And so what we now need to do is debate it out in the public about what kinds of solutions really are, gonna really help us meet the needs.
And to your question of, well, what if many of the environmental solutions may be in conflict with human flourishing? Again, that's why we need all stakeholders, all political parties, we need people of faith, we need marginalized communities at the table to come to those solutions that make sure that, again, just as Rachel was saying, that no one is left behind, that everyone is left better off from these solutions. And I'll share one just example of success that my colleagues at EEN, this was before my time there, but Republican Senator Braun from Indiana, he is leading he's the bipartisan member of the Senate Bipartisan Climate Solutions Caucus. And he tells the story of how Senator Coons, Democrat, was the Democratic leader. He wanted to find a Republican. He went and asked all around Capitol Hill, will you join me? Will you join me? No, no, no. Senator Braun was coming in as a freshman in his first year as a senator. And when Senator Coons asked him, he said yes. And the reason that he said yes was because he had heard from evangelical pastors back in his home state that we care about this, that we want to see you take climate action for Indiana. And again, what does it look like for all of us and evangelicals and Christians across the country, especially in red states, to come and advocate and lend our voice and share why we care, because it's for the people that we care about and for your constituents. Yeah. We want to see you be a leader in this. What would the power of that, if we can replicate that across the country?
Yeah. Okay, questions that you submitted, curated by Jason Woodman. So if it isn't read out just like you wrote it, Jason's in the back there. You can find him with his hand up. With all the political posturing over how to address climate change, we're just talking about that through policy, how much of our response comes down to simply consuming less?
I'll reframe that in a different way. I think it really comes down to the things that we do, that God has entrusted to us to steward. Do we hold them precious? Do we see, again, the inherent value of that with the food that we eat? Do we recognize the hands that prepared it, what it took to make it, the things that we do consume? Do we understand, again, all the steps that took it from the beginning to being in our hands? And do we appreciate and value that? And so I think it's more taking that, how can we be less wasteful? And how can we put more value on the material world that we have today? Because we do live in, especially here in the US, in a throwaway culture right now. What does it look like to rediscover what our grandparents, of appreciating the value of the material and how hard it is to get to that? So that's one thing that I'm really interested in, of getting away from the fast fashion, but really valuing the clothes that we wear. We can look at that in all different ways. And actually, I think the COVID crisis has helped us appreciate that a bit more, because what's one of the buzzwords over the last 3 years? Supply chain.
Yeah, right.
Because we've offshored everything, but now we begin to see how interconnected everything is. We're understanding the supply chain that gives us a sense of all the work that goes into what we have. Maybe we'll hold on to it and take better care of it moving forward.
Thank you. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, no, great. I think it invites us in to think about how to do life differently. And it might not look exactly the same for you as me in any given, time, because we all have different seasons of life. We all have different spheres of influence. And so less like thinking about it like a checklist of are you doing these 10 things? And if you're not, like, shame on you. Think about inviting it in to say, like, man, what would it look like for me to live in a way that was continuing to bear witness to those things that I say that I value.
Right.
And maybe it's starting with that one thing that seems like, oh, that seems like something I can try to do. And then doing it well and telling the story of the why, and just even sometimes inviting people into the why is like, oh, that's interesting. What is it? What else could I do? And then it might be that you expand the things that you might be able to do at any given time. Your choices, we talked about that earlier, might change. But it's that spirit of like, how do I be more self-reflective about, the kinds of values that I say I have in the way that maybe they're consistent or not with the way I'm living out. Not to be perfect, because you're not going to be perfect, but to say, what is it that I can do?
Yeah, excellent. Thank you. Next question. Do the programs designed to combat emissions reinforce existing inequalities? For example, replacing older cars in emission-controlled areas with tax credits for much more expensive electric cars.
I was just talking to somebody about this. Because I was giving this very example, because in Maryland, we just passed legislation, Advanced Clean Cars too. So now we have a mandate to sell 100% electric vehicles in our state by 2035. That is an enabling policy to help drive emission reductions in transportation, but by itself, it does not ensure equitable access, for example, to electric vehicles, right?
Right.
What has to be complemented with that is a holistic understanding of how do we build up charging infrastructure that's accessible to everyone where they work and live, and maybe in some ways being even more creative in multifamily housing units about how that's going to work. It's also thinking about how to provide more incentives so that people have the option to purchase an electric vehicle,
right,
which they actually save money the minute that they drive it off the lot, but it's still the upfront ticket price that sometimes makes it feel inaccessible. So by itself, that example isn't enough to ensure that equity actually happens on the ground, even if the solution speaks to the fact that all of the air pollution that many of those communities are facing because of all of the normal gasoline vehicles on the road is incredibly high. How do we make it so they can participate in the solution, not just be like, have all the other wealthy people in the state drive their electric vehicles so that hopefully, I'm better off. So exactly, we have to have a holistic framework for how we're driving solutions that involve people in communities participating in it.
And that holistic solution includes how we work, how we structure our lives, where we house people and distance, what we value as individuals, wanting that extra space to live further away, right? Well, those are big cultural issues, not just policy issues, right?
So it can't just be the government participating.
The government, right?
The government might set some of that enabling policy, that's part of its function, but that by itself is not enough to change the culture.
True confession, I thoroughly enjoyed my $7,500 tax credit for leasing a plug-in hybrid.
Good.
And I'll say again, that's the power of the marketplace too, is as those who can invest in buying an electric vehicle or buying organic, sustainably sourced food, that again helps create the marketplace so that it is more affordable, more folks begin to be doing business like that, and that becomes the norm so that everyone can access those food, driving down those prices. There's also just wonderful creative ways of, again, putting equity at the center, of making sure that I've seen programs out of California that are putting aside special grants for low-income residents to be able to purchase electric vehicles. We've got one of our champions, Public Commissioner Tim Echols in Georgia, has a program motivated by his Christian faith of receiving used Priuses and giving them to single mothers. And again, when it comes down to the reliability, actually, this is really interesting about EVs, is that because they have less component parts, they break down less. And so you save on those maintenance costs, and also that means that it's less time lost at work. If your car breaks down, you've got to get to the repair shop, you've got to cover those costs, you've got to miss those days of work to do it, you can't get to where you need to be. Those are real stressors, especially for our low-income brothers and sisters. And so this can be, again, if we help give that hand up to be able to access that, it can lead to addressing a lot of inherent problems that causes stress throughout someone's life.
Very nice, thank you. I like the comprehensive price. We live in ecosystems, and so being able to address systems and all the consequences makes a ton of sense. So I'm going to amend the next question. It begins for our presenters who flew to Denver. I'm pretty sure you can know where the ... dot's going, but I'm going to add in there, and for Denver Seminary, who invited our presenters to fly to Denver. How do we justify this in our carbon footprint?
Yeah, well, I can tell you at EN, we offset our emissions. Another responsible thing that we can all do when it comes to flying, because it's not just to come out and have these conversations, but also to see loved ones. We don't want to make someone feel that shame of, I'm going to go visit a loved one and I need to fly. Does that mean I'm not I don't care for the environment if I don't fly, or I'm not a good Christian if I do this. We've got to get away from that shame and guilt and look at how we can do things better. And so one way, if you do fly, one rule of thumb is to look for nonstop flights if you can afford them. And so again, it's kind of looking at those good, better, best options. But also, one exciting thing that we're working with several farmers in the Midwest on is the advent of sustainable aviation fuels. Again, the airline industry is going to be really hard to decarbonize. It's going to be really hard to we can't put batteries. They're going to be too big to put on our airplane. So we've got to look at something else. And so we're working with farmers in Iowa who are producing sustainable biofuels, who are measuring the carbon intensity of all of their operations to get it as low as possible. Delta's been out there to tour what they're doing, and whenever they're getting their carbon intensity lower, that's also using less synthetic fertilizers. They're using natural ways to enhance their soil. It means it's improving the water quality. And again, it's one of those holistic, when we look at this system together and find that better solution, it can actually lead to more opportunities in a way that we wouldn't even imagine on our own. So I'm really excited about that.
You bet.
I wouldn't add much more to it other than I think both of our organizations offset through Climate Stewards, who you heard about today.
Yeah.
But one of the premises, of course, of Climate Stewards is reducing first and then offsetting the rest. So it's making sure that when you are traveling, or you know, there is a footprint related to what you're doing, that you make it count. So it's visiting with people, it's coming for this, and also seeing who else you can connect with. I am visiting my sister tomorrow, so I am visiting loved ones. But it's really trying, I think Catherine Hayhoe does this very well. When she agrees to go somewhere, for example, to fly, she's very conscious of that. She just maximizes her time in that area, which is part of raising awareness and talking to people and having critical in-person conversations you might not otherwise be able to do. So it's still acknowledging there is a trade-off. It is offsetting what you are not avoiding, and then trying to make the most of it.
I think from the seminary's perspective, we think of it in terms of also net carbon footprint, right? So if what we learn here ultimately creates savings in carbon footprint because we've learned and we pass that on to other folks, we can feel a little bit better about it anyway. It is interesting to me, so I fly a bit, and I'm basically an indentured servant to United Airlines. They've been very proactive in attempting to identify your carbon footprint. So now when you go online to book a flight, it's there for you, and also the other fuels. So that I do think there are some efforts, or there are some very clever marketing ploys to get you to think that they're involved in efforts. And yes, as you get older, you do become more skeptical. That's true.
Well, just on that note, my background research is how to actually count the carbon, particularly related to nature-based solutions, which is often what's treated as the offset. And so
Yeah.
a healthy amount of skepticism to make sure that it's real and verifiable is a good thing.
Yeah.
But there are true, real efforts. So I think, continuing to, again, reduce as much as you can, and then offsetting the rest with reliable partners, I think is critical.
Good strategy, very practical. How accurate were the temperature measurements taken 75, 100, or 140 years ago, and where were they taken?
Ooh, that's a great question. I wish I had my slide deck. And so that has validating the reliability of that data has been an effort that my colleagues have taken into serious account for decades of looking at the different measurement ways of whether back in 1880 are we looking at ship ballast measurements to our amazing technology that we have today from satellites and having observation systems deployed across the globe. And so there's been a lot of work of doing that verification and quantitative assessment, and then also going to verify that with physical climate models too, verifying that with paleoclimate records that my colleagues and I produce. And so really looking at filling in all of those gaps, comparing things from all different sources that we can have. And so again, the observational record that we have going from 1880 to the future, as well as going back in the past, is very robust. And also what you would have seen, not in my graph, because I was showing a more simplified version, but you definitely saw it in Dr. Lamb's graph of temperature change. Did you see those color envelopes?
Yeah.
That's the uncertainty. So quantifying down to the number, the level of uncertainty in those measurements is something that if you don't do that right, that record is not going to make it into the observational record. It's not going to be used as input in our climate simulations and modeling. And so we have a really robust handle on what we do know and what we don't. And again, what we do know continues to point towards global warming. It's climate change. It's happening. It's real. It's us.
Yeah.
I don't have anything to add to that.
All right. I'm not sure I ever knew there was a paleoclimatology kind of thing.
It's really fascinating.
I know, and then I met one, so thank you for doing that. I didn't even know it needed to be done.
Well, if you ever want to, I will say also, what I love about this work is awe and wonder.
Yes.
I get to, as my profession, study God's creation and just again, Dr. Lim, you said it too, of just it is magnificent.
Yeah.
And that was learning about paleoclimate and how God has left us clues in his creation to figure out what the climate was like before we had weather stations to observe it. It captured my imagination, and is something that got me also into that field, that mission side of things, but also the imagination side of things.
I think most of us have gotten our paleoclimatology from Disney, Ice Age, right?
Actually, you should correct me if I'm wrong on this, but I think
Maybe
one of the largest facilities in the U.S. that houses and studies ice cores is actually based here in Colorado. Actually, not that far from Denver, I don't think. I visited the facility one time. So actually, the ongoing work to better understand the historical record happens right
next door.
Yes, you all are spoiled. Boulder has one of the highest concentrations of climate scientists across the full breadth of the discipline, from paleoclimatologists to modelers. All of it is right here at home. Boulder is a destination for climate scientists and a real hub. And so, again, thinking about those local resources that you have, that is something that you can tap into. And actually, I helped stand up one of the first faith-based committees for one of the science disciplines. So for the American Meteorological Society, they've started a committee on science, multi-faith, and spirituality. And the leader of that, Carlos Martinez, is a scientist over at Boulder.
Yeah, he called me, actually.
Oh, good.
Yeah. And I was very impressed by what they're trying to do. Yeah.
Yeah, and he came up with a wonderful acronym for it is COSMOS.
Cosmos, yeah.
Yeah, and it's housed in in BRAID, which is their board for diversity and inclusion, and recognizing that spiritual faith also should be part of that conversation, and it's a real leader for the rest of the science organizations of doing that work of breaking down that conflict between science and faith. So it's really excited. And it's started by a climate scientist here in Boulder.
Yeah. And not just with Christian faith. It's
It's multi-faith.
pluralistic, yeah. Okay, next question. Trees and grass, which are good for the environment, use a lot of water. This is a huge deal for us here in the West. How does this balance with energy-related issues?
Yeah, interestingly, so in Maryland, for example, probably the natural land cover, if you had to go back several thousand years, would be forest. So for us, reforestation is kind of like restoring it back to what it's, the local hydrology and sort of what you would expect to be there. So you should always ask where trees are supposed to be before you plant them, because it is true that trees can be a maladaptive strategy if they're not going to where they're originally supposed to be. So that's not common in much of the United States, but certainly in the West where trees are obviously a part of your natural landscape, but in some places, particularly down in more like the Southwest, trees just feel like a hazard. And so there's a big question about whether reforestation is the best long-term climate strategy with increasing wildfire risk and insect disease. But maybe it makes sense in some places, and places where actually restoring the local native hydrology is actually a win for water. So reforestation in places where trees belong can be good for the local ecosystem, including water. But in some places, it might not be the best solution. So there might be other more native ecological solutions that might be more appropriate that are still about restoration. So you kind of have to know the difference. But certainly when I talk to colleagues, for example, in New Mexico, and they hear about all of Maryland's tree planting goals, I was like, wow, that's a lot of trees. I don't know if, we're trying to protect what we have, but it's a big question about whether putting in new trees is going to be net beneficial. So you got to be smart about the local ecology, and you got to know where it really is a win-win.
Yeah, it's got to be that place-based solution, and you'll find that in some places grasslands are best suited and can do amazing carbon sequestration of preserving those wetlands, where that's appropriate. And then also looking at permaculture solutions. And I'm not a permaculture expert, but again, it's even in our own yards, we have that cultural kind of affinity for a beautiful green manicured lawn. Is that the right for your specific setting and climate? Is that the right place? Can you still have a beautiful lawn and garden, but it is more natural and using different elements? I'm a geologist. I think rocks are beautiful. Can you incorporate more beautiful rocks into that landscaping of permaculture? So again, I think as we think about beauty also of being more creative and expanding our horizons on what beauty can look like in our setting that is appropriate for that place.
Yeah, what we'd say where I grew up is you just went from preaching to meddling. Talking about our yards.
Don't touch that. It's a third rail.
What is the environmental impact of disposing of batteries?
Also the really hot topic, because we're trying to electrify everything. And then we're also, by the way, you can't electrify with also making sure your electricity is clean.
Right.
So both. But there's a big question about what to keep doing with batteries and make sure that they're disposed of properly. I think it's like this with a lot of solutions. We imagine the end when we begin. And then as we're working through this, that's where market innovation and a lot of awesome science and technology comes in and says, like, how can we do better on this? And actually, there's some ways in which mandates can help with that, like proposing solutions that also imagine, how recycling and disposables are a part of it when you're in the process of actually developing the technology to begin with. So I think that there are some cutting edge strategies around this. I think we still have some ways to go, but I don't view it as like a zero-sum game in the sense of like, well, or black and white, like, okay, well, if there's going to be any problem with this new solution, let's just torpedo it and not move forward, as if the things we're currently using now don't have lots of problems.
Right.
They do.
Right.
They're just a little, maybe they're, so it's part of the conversation, part of the strategy. We have to name the risks so that we can better address them and reduce them. But I'm not too worried. I feel like we've got some strategy.
Yeah, and you're exactly right. Of first looking at that full life cycle assessment of everything that we're using, and that's becoming the industry standard, which is really exciting from beginning to end. Really wonderful innovations with wind turbines. And again, Rachel, you really nail it of saying that it's so often, especially in our whataboutism type world, of, well, what about this negative thing, and let's just dismiss it. That happens all the time. One thing with wind turbines, of what do we do with all these wind turbines when they're done? Some incredible technology coming out of our, innovations coming out of our national labs of being able to melt those things down with new innovative advanced materials and to repurpose them, use them again. Very exciting. And so again, that's a really creative time that as we have these questions, well, what about this? Well, let's get to making that solution using the ingenuity that God has given us. He's the ultimate innovator, and we're made in his image. And so we are inherently creative and innovative. How can we use that to solve these problems? How can we learn, again, from the mistakes of the past to do things better? Another thing that comes up with batteries as well, that's also an extractive industry. It can be very polluting. It can be very damaging to the environment, but we need these critical minerals to go into the batteries that are going to power the clean economy. Should we just move on to something else? This just won't work. And I think the real answer is, how can we do this better? How can we make sure from the very beginning that working with local communities to make sure that land, water, air is preserved, especially a lot of these mining sites here in the U.S. are also on indigenous communities' lands. And so how can we also respect the sacred land rights of those where the land is there? There's also huge human rights issues as well. You may have heard about where we're currently sourcing critical minerals coming from the Democratic Republic of Congo, coming from China, which have serious human rights abuses with that mining. Again, how can we make sure that we put international pressure on through advocacy to clean that up, through with the industry as well, but also as we're doing that, bringing that mining back here at home, how do we make sure that it's done right too? These are really thorny questions that we have to grapple with and deal with. And again, as people of faith, having that care for people and for creation, and ultimately to honor God in all that we do. We are a critical voice in that conversation.
That was actually the next question, the extraction of rare earth minerals and the production of batteries. My wife and I were recently in South Africa, and we were enjoying the Stellenbosch region, where they have all the vineyards. And it occurred to me while we were taking in the beauty of that place and enjoying the fruit of the land. It's hard to imagine anything that humans do in relationship to the land and in relationship to other people that doesn't have a downside. It seems to me, I have to tease this out, that one of the consequences of the brokenness and fallenness of humanity is that everything we do has an underbelly in relationship to creation, in relationship to others. And so being willing to admit that, and then as you talked about, not throwing up our hands and saying we can't do anything, but understanding and striving for less underbelly, less of a negative consequence. But I do think, I don't say that in a fatalistic sense. I say that in a realistic sense. That is one of the tragic consequences of the fall.
There's a book by Dr. Noah Tolley called The Gardener's Dirty Hands, which I think is a really excellent discussion on sort of the tragic consequences of the world we live in, but how sort of naming what's tragic, but
Yes.
not falling into despair or then throwing up our hands and
That's right.
sort of being invited into paralysis. That there's a way to address perceived conflict and actually keep working at it, because sometimes on face value, which might seem irresolvable, actually isn't as much as we might think. Like at some level, yes.
Sure.
Yes, there's a tension there. But sometimes pressing in and grieving over where there's loss and not trying to absolve ourselves of responsibility, but naming that there's a tragic choice there and then working to the good wherever we can.
Yes.
To me, that's actually kind of liberating, because it's actually better than the alternative as either saying it's too complicated, I can't do anything, or feeling like I can't do anything because I'll never be able to get something perfectly. I find it's important to just, to name the tension, understand the trade-offs, reduce the risk wherever you can, take responsibility wherever you can. But man, if the vision is restoration, and that is not my vision, that's the one who created this world, then I can keep working and hoping that it goes back and God uses it in some way.
That's right. All the negative consequences of that underbelly creates grief and lament and a resolve to address what we can. But at the same time, we recognize until the Lord restores all things, it will be with us. I think Jesus said something about that. It wasn't that the government is the problem. That's not what he said.
And I think one thing that also I like to keep in my own context is when we look at all of living things, every living thing has an impact on everything else. It's not just us as humans, but God created an interconnected world where every living thing has an impact on everything else in a big or a small way. We, however, are a species that is inherently mindful and aware of our impact. And so again, I think John Calvin said to have frugal and moderate use of what we need, I think is a good guide for us. But sometimes I've heard from others, especially who are very consumed by climate grief and eco-anxiety, that I'm trying to reduce my impact as much as I can, but I still have an impact, of course, because every living thing does. We can only do as much as each person can.
Right. Here's another question. How can poor people who rent their homes make the necessary adaptations to properly weather and still honor their landlords?
Yeah, that's a really, really important component to this, because often the worst kept homes are rental homes, and it's not in the power of the renter to be able to do that. And so that's something that Commissioner Tim Echols in Georgia cares deeply about as a public. Commissioner Tim Echols in Georgia, he's a public utility commissioner, Christian as well. But again, this is advocacy. What does it look like to hold landlords accountable? What does it look like to make sure that renters, when they are seen, is this a place that I can, am I going to rent this place? Having information about the energy efficiency score of that rental property and being informed about that. But again, also just creating those either through incentives or sticks if we need to make sure that the housing stock, affordable housing, is also energy efficient. Another component with that is often it's also unsafe for health. Often low-income housing has a lot of mold issues
Right,
as well
right.
that make the building envelope just completely unstable. And so this is a holistic solution. What is really exciting to me is as there's new funds through the bipartisan infrastructure law, through that weatherization program, not only to address energy efficiency, but also to address some of those structural issues that in the past precluded and made certain developments, they weren't eligible for that because they had other structural issues like mold and something, leaky roofs, that we're not going to invest in this housing.
Right.
So, but just keeping that at the center of solving that problem for renters is really important.
Really, yeah.
I don't know.
No, that's a great, I think that's a
else?
great example of a carrot and a
Marilyn.
stick, because on the stick side, it's, for example, like we're requiring building energy performance standards, and so all large buildings, even multifamily buildings, have to start reaching a new standard. But the good news is that if you're thinking about those that own the buildings and thinking about, man, what about the costs associated with doing that by a certain time? These billions of dollars of incentive, literally billions of dollars of incentive monies, are coming down to actually provide the assistance to help cover the gap, so that sure, there's a regulatory incentive, but there's also a voluntary incentive for you to access the capital to help. And there's lots of great financing solutions. I think there's more actually opportunities to do it. I think it's just helping people. There's a matchmaking that's necessary, and sort of there is an advocacy component to still make sure that people are, want to do it. And sometimes it does take communities themselves, unfortunately, sticking up for themselves and their current conditions to try to do better. And I think we are learning. We have an opportunity here.
Yeah.
Building code might sound very boring, but it's very important.
Yeah. In terms of advocacy, you mentioned the bipartisan infrastructure legislation. That's on the table as they negotiate debt ceiling. What would be effective, pointed advocacy to retain provisions in that infrastructure legislation, if we wanted to advocate with our representatives?
Yeah, Rachel, I'll let you cover some that I miss, but again, this is a wonderful carrot and stick program, the Methane Emissions Reduction Program, which is aimed at for natural gas production to cut out those methane leaks, putting a pollution fee on that through that program, but then also providing the resources, the money that needs to be done to do that work. That's being provided too. That's on right now within that debt ceiling bill that's on the table to be repealed. And actually in the House, they did vote to repeal that. The incentives, tax rebates, tax credits and rebates for homeowners to do energy efficiency upgrades and to electrify, upgrade your appliances, and all that pot of money that everyone's got set aside, that's been voted against in the debt ceiling bill, and many others as well.
Well, if you've never done it, you can call the person that represents you. You can write them a letter, you can call them, you can also show up at their office. And they care about you if you live in their district because, yeah, you're a voter. But there's opportunities to raise a collective voice as well. So there's what you think as an individual, but you don't even have to be the expert on all of the policy.
Right.
It's complicated. Really, they want to know what it is that you care about. It's like, you're here representing our interests, and look, we think that these kinds of programs actually are good for us, it's good for our community, it's good for the people that live here, it's good for the economy. Like, fight for that. You can make it that simple, and that's a way that you can raise your voice in a targeted way for the people that are there to represent you, even if you don't agree with them on everything.
Yeah,
Tell them what you do.
And be nice if you call.
Yes.
Yeah, our son worked as an intern in the Congress, and he got those calls.
Oh, gosh. Again, bless all the staffers
Yes.
who work in these offices. Saying a thank you goes a long way.
Yes.
It opens the heart to then receive. It
Yes.
sets the tone for the conversation of not being combative, but being
Yes.
productive. And again, at the Evangelical Environmental Network, Young Evangelicals for Climate Action, that is what we exist to help you do. We want to come alongside to make any way that you want to advocate with your policymakers as easy as possible, hopefully fun too. But again, hearing from local constituents that these programs, we like them, we are using them, keep them, is what's going to make the difference. Of hearing from you is so important. And so again, EN, YECA, we'd love to come and help you do that if that's of interest to you.
Excellent. We have time for one more, but with short answers, please. What are your opinions on switching to nuclear energy?
Nuclear done right is a really important solution, especially for replacing coal and natural gas as that base load energy. But it has to be done right, it has to be done safely. And one thing that I'm excited about is that with some of the new advanced nuclear technologies, is it can take the nuclear waste from first generation reactors and use that as energy. And so it has to be done right, it has to be done safely. But it can be an incredible solution for decarbonizing hard to industries that are hard to get the carbon emissions out of, as well as providing that stable base load in our energy system that we need.
Feel the same way, so ditto on that.
Great, thanks. Thank you. Well, let me say thank you to all of you for being a part of this today. Let's thank our panelists one more time. And I want to remind you that if you're interested in next steps, interested in what we're going to do in the public engagement side of TGI, on the church engagement side of TGI, there'll be a gathering across the hallway just after we finish here in just a moment. We would appreciate very much if you would continue to pray for us at Denver Seminary as we attempt to fulfill our mission statement, which is to prepare men and women to engage the needs of the world with the redemptive power of the gospel and the life-changing truth of Scripture. And so as we pursue that, we step into tough conversations, and sometimes there's positive feedback about that, and sometimes there's negative feedback about that. So if you pray for us as we move forward to have the courage to step into these tough issues with a truly gospel-centered desire, we would appreciate it very much. Thanks again for coming. We'll look forward to seeing you at our next event in the fall. And God bless you. Thank you.